The Veteran's Voice, stories that deserve to be heard, is proudly sponsored by Calling Gilbert, Wright & Carter.
Hi, I'm Bill Derrick, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, and this is my story. In 2001, when September 11th happened, I was a junior in high school, and it really affected, obviously, all my family. My grandfather served in World War II in the Marine Corps. My other grandfather served in World War II and was at Iwo Jima with the Navy and was a corpsman. A sense of duty and a sense of country and service always struck me as something that I needed to pursue. Once I started at Florida State and was a freshman there in 2003, the war kicked off in March. When you're talking about a sense of self and you're attempting to see what you can do that's bigger than yourself, I decided that it was time for me to join. But with my father being from the Air Force, my grandfathers being from both the Navy and the Marine Corps, it was up to me to make a decision on which branch that was going to be. I went to every recruiting station, and the Marine Corps really struck me as what was going to be one of the more difficult boot camps to go through. And that's about all I had thought about, was just boot camp, make it through boot camp. And once I got there and realized that that we weren't just training to be better men to serve our country, we were training to go to war. That's when it hit me that this was the decision that I was proud of making. I was happy to have pushed myself to sign that contract and to raise my right hand. Almost so much that I actually talked my brother into joining. He did 8 years as well and a couple of deployments. So boot camp was very interesting. I think everyone that serves, no matter what branch, will tell you that their recruiter was the best and worst salesman that they had ever met. My recruiter wanted to inform me as much as possible about what I would be going through, different phases of boot camp. I knew that it would be difficult, but I wanted to go in without technology on my side. A lot of friends would get emails and updates and things like that to let them know exactly what they would be experiencing in boot camp. I wanted to go into it blind so that I could take everything in. We pulled up to boot camp, and of course you're rushed out of the bus to step on the yellow footprints at Parris Island. And that's when my life definitely changed. Coming from a household of discipline, I think the assimilation for me to get into boot camp and to understand that aye sir, yes sir, no sir were my only three possible answers, no sir being probably the one that I used the least. Really, boot camp ended up becoming a stepping stone for me into the Corps almost immediately. I was blessed with 3 drill instructors that all came from the infantry field. So all three phases of boot camp, we focused in on infantry tactics and different techniques, tactics. We did hand and arm signals for the last 2 months of boot camp. I had a very, I would say, different experience than the majority of people. I felt immersed into the Corps immediately instead of being taught how to be disciplined. Really, boot camp for me, once it ended, people think that while you're in boot camp, I can't wait for it to be over. The reality is, the reason why you should not wait for it to be over is because it's only the beginning. Once I left and I went to engineer school as a combat engineer, I then went to Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point for my duty stations. First deployment was quite interesting. I was a Lance Corporal at the time. I had only about a year and a half in the Marine Corps at the moment. So you go in and you go over there with a sense of not really knowing what you're going to get yourself into. Even though we did 9 months of training up until that departure date, you're more getting to know, weapon systems and things like that. But the reality is that we were all getting really close during those field ops. And that sense of unity really carried us through that first deployment. During my first deployment to Iraq, I deployed to Al Asad Air Base. We spent about 50% of that time outside the wire repairing IED holds, building up Iraqi police department sites, and things of that nature, while also maintaining hearts and minds throughout the entire deployment. A misconception of a deployment to Iraq, especially during 2006, was that everything was crazy. I've spoken to a lot of even infantry Marines, and even though those times are tough, you have to maintain, even though it's incredibly difficult because of your day-to-day actions and indirect fire, direct fire, mortars, rockets, everything that you deal with on a daily basis, there's still an underlying human element in Iraq that needed to be pulled out. I use a silly term that I am thankful for the fact that I got to go back to Iraq in the same location, same area of operation, 2 years apart. The reason why I use the term thankful is because the impression that the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan have given civilians back home is the interpretation of the news media. Whether that's positive or negative is for anybody to decide, but for somebody that's going through it personally and seeing that same area 2 years apart, in 2006 we were hit by mortars and rockets at least twice a week, sometimes 3 or 4, and multiple rocket attacks. And the time that we spent outside the wire was constantly hectic. Every community that we went to, from Haditha Dam down the Euphrates to Hit, north of Haditha Dam by Ramadi and everything around those areas of operation, people were inside. No music, no shops open, and these are not people that are trying to harm us. These are people that were simply trying to live their lives. When I went back in 2008, we were a security battalion. Instead of doing the typical combat engineering work, I was B-billeted a 0311 MOS infantryman. I led patrols of 14 Marines, 1 Navy doctor, and an interpreter through that area of operation. We would get updates on our Blue Force tracker system, which is basically a glorified GPS, letting us know what buildings to check out, what areas to be aware of, and also what perhaps vehicles to look out for, and even high-value individuals. That was much more real for me because at the time I was a corporal deploying as a patrol leader, to have men underneath you, men and women underneath you, and to be in that role of keeping them safe was so much more heavy than my first deployment, where it was head down, do what you're told, make sure that you do it to the best of your ability. Those days were a little bit more rough because we were outside of the wire for about 80% of the deployment, 7 out of the 9 months, I would say, at least. When you come in contact with people that are over there, Sunni, Shiite, it doesn't matter what your background is. If you're human to them, they respond while constantly being on guard because every scenario is different. And the times that we had over in Iraq in 2008 were so different in regards to communities. The communities in Iraq, at least the area that I was at, south of Baghdad, they were starting to come together. You were starting to hear music. You were starting to see shops open up, kids out in the streets, things like that. To watch on the news now, 10 years almost after I spent time in Iraq, and to watch ISIS take over al-Assad and take over Baghdadi outside of, and to know that we spent so much time, effort, an insane amount of capital from the government on trying to help these people out, and then to vacate, it takes you a little bit of time to be okay with that, because you feel like you spent a large portion of your life helping people, and that's now fallen by the wayside. But in retrospect, what could we have done? It's a scary thought on a daily basis. Coming home, that post-deployment health assessment that the VA did for us and continues to do for us is very important. But I would say the reality is that the three major plagues that are hitting veterans are homelessness, suicide rate, and just I would say education. Suicide rate obviously falls within PTSD, and just that finding that strength, that mental strength that maybe you lost, or a lot of times that PTSD, when you join and when you rejoin the civilian sector after you're 4 or 20, or it doesn't matter how long you served. My most difficult part of reassimilating back into the civilian world was finding something that compared to the satisfaction and the accomplishment that I felt on a daily basis. There isn't a Marine that I know or a service member that I know that said, that comes home and said, hey, it was great saving lives over there. You were doing your job. And if you did it right, you saved lives. And if you did it right, you kept the men and women next to you safe. But the overwhelming reality is that I think that until the civilian sector gets involved in the treatment of PTSD, homeless veterans, and creating jobs and making jobs more accessible to veterans, and knowing the worth of a veteran, until the civilian sector gets involved in that in a heavy way, there is no government agency that is going to do enough good for us in that way. Because I'm in talks with several people right now with putting together some type of free recruiting process, and also some type of wealth management program for enlisted service members. The reality is that we're creating something in the military that a lot of people don't know, and I think that we're creating that mentality of, I can do my job, and as long as I do my job, just as long as I do my job on par, I'm going to get health insurance. I'm going to be able to go to the dentist. I'm going to be able to be seen by a doctor whenever I need it. I'm going to get the education that I need. That's what you're promised when you join the military. And, I'm sorry, but when you're 18, most 18-year-olds are not ready for, if you come from a town of 500 people and all of a sudden you have enough money to purchase a car, enough money to, you're 18, video games, childish things that you were not privy to before, you're wasting your money for 4 years on. So, I got out of the Marine Corps after investing and doing the right thing, not purchasing anything and going to the chow hall every day. I had a decent 5 figures when I got out of the Marine Corps, and I'd say there isn't but 20% maybe that get out with that amount of money. And that should be setting you up for going to school to better yourself. And while there is a facade that the VA provides you with material and provides you with other outlets, until we motivate the people that are actually in and make them see that the day that you get out of the military, you're going to have to take care of yourself. People will start living a lot more responsibly while they're in the military, and that'll help with homelessness, job creation. Veterans are huge small business creators right now. We're given the tools, but unless you have that mental capacity, unless you have that drive built into you, there aren't a lot of people holding the hands of these, what are essentially children, kids that are 18, 19 years old joining the military. We need to give them better tools in the civilian world so that they can succeed. And I think that you'll see a lot of the homelessness, a lot of the, unemployment. You'll see all those rates are lower. But, I can't be happier with what the VA has done for PTSD, for mental health, for everything. But I would really like to see commercials and people, not painting such a doom and gloom picture. Because while it is difficult, the PTSD is something that is also a byproduct of trying to find that thing that gives you that drive and gives you that motivation and that accomplishment that I spoke of, where not a lot of jobs in the civilian sector, unless you go into law enforcement, are going to have that brotherhood, sisterhood, sense of accomplishment, feeling that you're doing good on a daily basis. And the more we as civilians, can support our service members, I think the better we'll be.